Okay, we're here for the third episode of the Greater Texas Podcast, and we're on location this week in Dallas, Texas. And I happen to be joined by a fantastic litigator here in Dallas, and he does a special type of litigation that's relevant to the commercial industry world. So Dan Tobin, thanks very much for joining us. Really appreciate it.
Sean, thanks for having me, and thanks for making your way up 35 to Dallas. I hope the construction and the traffic wasn't too bad.
I flew up on the JSX. Have we talked about this yet, or no? Are you familiar with it?
I think, is it the private?
It does. It goes out of like private in Austin and private to Dallas, and it's like 20 or 30 seats, and it's not particularly like super expensive or anything like that. It's really convenient. I mean, because it goes out of private, you show up 20 minutes before the flight or whatever. Anyway, this isn't an advertisement for JSX, and I want to do that on the show. But anyway, that was what we did this yesterday, actually. So
yeah, I've heard of that.
Good to be here.
Yeah, I've heard of that going to West Texas. I hadn't heard of it from Austin.
Yeah.
Sounds like a souped up Von Lane.
Yeah, exactly. So, all right. Well, let's start with a little background too. Where did you grow up, Dan?
I grew up in Rochester, New York, which is in the western part of the state.
Sure.
When I tell folks from Texas I'm from New York, they immediately think New York City.
Right.
But I actually was closer to Canada than New York City.
I hear you. I grew up in Detroit, so I know exactly what that's like.
Yeah.
In fact, I shouldn't say this on the podcast, but when I was between my freshman year and sophomore year in college, everybody would go to Canada at night because the drinking age was 19 in Canada, and so that was like what everybody would do. But anyway, those were different times. So is that how you ended up at the University of Buffalo?
Yes, I'm the youngest of 7, and by the time I got around, my parents had made their way through financially, so they said to me, if you go to a state school, we'll pay for it. If you want to go to a non-state school, you'll have to make up the difference. And New York's public school or college system's not like Texas. We don't have a huge flagship, but
right.
University of Buffalo is pretty close to it.
Gotcha.
And it's about an hour from Rochester. So, you think at the time you're ready to leave home, but in retrospect, that was still a homebody. And going an hour from home was a good fit. So.
Gotcha. Now, you must have had tons of snow out there in Buffalo, right?
Yeah. In fact, I just saw a stat that Buffalo won the award this year for the most snowfall in the country.
My family still lives in Michigan, and literally, I don't know what today is, the 22nd or something. Literally on the 19th of April, it was snowing up there. It's just insane. I keep telling them, you don't have to do that anymore. You can move, right?
Yeah. I would get out of class at 3:30, and it'd be dark, pitch dark.
Right. Exactly. So then, I guess you went to law school. How did you end up at SMU for law school?
Right. So I did pretty good at University of Buffalo. I finally figured out that grades matter. And fortunately for me, my now wife had moved from Dallas to Buffalo. Her dad took a job there.
Gotcha.
And they hated Buffalo, not surprisingly, coming from Dallas in the mid-'90s. Right. Or late 90s, early aughts. So they quickly headed back to Dallas. In the meantime, she followed them to college. We met at Buffalo. And when we both graduated University of Buffalo, she was going to get her master's in physical therapy, and I was going to law school, and finally I was now ready to leave Western New York.
Right.
So, and although I looked at different colleges, or different law schools, I should say, Dallas was a natural fit because her family had moved back here.
Gotcha. And what made you, or how did you figure out you wanted to go to law school, or what's that whole story?
Well, my father's a lawyer.
Okay.
And he's, not to be too sacrimonious, but he's sort of an Atticus Finch type.
Gotcha.
I grew up in a small one-light town.
Yeah.
And he was the town's lawyer, and we would get calls at night, and he was that prototypical small-town lawyer that had a great reputation.
Gotcha.
And so I was the only one of my siblings to go to law school, although he tried to get me not to go to law school.
Oh, he did?
Yeah. And but he was great, and that's kind of how I ended up. He exposed me to the law. And
so small town, did he have to do kind of a little bit of everything kind of law?
Yeah, he stayed away from criminal and family somehow. So he had a practice where he did, in New York, you have to have a lawyer to close on a residential real estate transaction.
I remember that, yeah.
So he did that. That was one book of business. Then he did randomly some ERISA work for some pensions. And then he did town municipal work so he had 3 buckets. So he sort of taught me the business side of the law as well, to make sure you have some buckets to fill.
Yeah,
So.
yeah. The business side, and I'm actually going to record a podcast after this about that. It's so underrated in this world, and they don't teach you that right out of law school. It's really interesting. Anyway, that's for another day. But so, what was your first job out of law school?
So when I got to SMU, I was sort of a small town boy in big city Dallas. I wanted a law firm with one office and less than 50 lawyers. And I was lucky enough to get a first-year clerkship with SettlePou, and they met that criteria.
Gotcha.
And so I clerked there in law school both years, and then they made me an offer to join on, so I joined at SettlePou.
And what were you doing?
I did the general litigation.
Gotcha.
I was hired in the litigation section. You know, when at law firms, they always need litigators.
Right. So how did you decide? Did you think about transactional at all, or were you totally litigation from the beginning? You wanted to do litigation?
I don't mind public speaking, and since I'm the youngest of 7, I'm kind of a smart aleck.
Right.
And grew up arguing with my brothers and sisters and my parents, so that comes naturally to me. And I went straight through, right?
Right, that's true, yeah.
Did you go straight through?
No, I worked for 2 years between.
Yeah, so when you go straight through, you think you know what you want.
Yeah.
But unless you're like a chemical...
Even if you work between, you think you know what you want, you still don't know.
So how I got into litigation was the lawyer that recruited me, Alan Smith. He is a dynamic litigator, and he's one of those folks that can just attract people. And so I wanted to work with him.
Gotcha.
And he was the litigator, so that's how I ended up in litigation.
It's really like when you're in law school or whatever, you think you know what being a lawyer is, and you just have no idea. And I'm not saying that to be like, oh, wow, look at me, I'm this old lawyer, but it's just the reality. You have no idea what it's like to be a lawyer. Like, it's just completely different. So, I mean, and you got to learn that. And I not to get off track again, but I wonder, we're going so much to remote work, right? And in fact, I've said this a couple times, like Quinn Emanuel, which is a big international firm, said a few months ago that they're no longer hiring for offices. They'll hire anybody anywhere, which I get. There's a lot of benefit to that. But for new lawyers coming out of law school, it's going to be really hard to sort of learn how to be a lawyer, right? If you're working remotely. Maybe it won't be. Maybe it'll be easy and they'll know how to do it. But it just seems to me like it would be really hard. I don't know what you think about that.
I agree. And then from the law firm, the firm itself perspective, if the light bulb goes off in that lawyer's head and they realize I can do this on my own from my living room or from an office share. When I was at SettlePou, we would lose lawyers because they would, I can cut my overhead and keep 90% of my receipts, so I'm making the same amount of money.
Right.
Again, not to get in the weeds, but it is a interesting dynamic, not to mention, folks don't stay at one job anymore.
True.
I mean, so you're hiring these folks. The runway has to be 2 to 4 years, unless it's that person just finds a niche that is completely perfect for them within that firm.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
Speaking of not staying, so how did you get into condemnation, which is what we're going to talk about today? Yeah.
Right. So, like I said, my father had a real estate background in his practice, so I had some exposure that way to just real estate practice.
Yeah.
And then, ironically, my first year at SettlePou, when I was a law student, Alan Smith, who I mentioned earlier, wanted me to research. He represents billboard companies, and he was trying to take the position that an outdoor advertising permit is a compensable property interest under eminent domain law.
Okay, got it.
So that when the government comes and takes the billboard, they have to pay for your permit.
Gotcha. Did it work?
I'm not going to say. I don't want to. I mean, that was 20 years ago. It was a difficult argument. I remember there was one or two.
It's an ingenious argument. I like it. Yeah.
He's a very creative lawyer, but there was 1 or 2 states outside of Texas that recognize permits as compensable.
Gotcha.
I can't remember if he's gotten a ruling on that in Texas or not.
Okay.
But often with billboards, those cases are very complex, both from a valuation standpoint and a free speech standpoint, constitutional issues. So that argument sometimes gets pushed to the wayside. But that's how I got introduced to condemnation law.
Gotcha. And did you do a little bit at that firm throughout your career there?
Right. Yes, I did. So for, let's say, the first 10 years, I was heavily involved with the billboard work,
Right.
which is 60 to 70% condemnation. Sometimes the billboard companies would have disputes with landlords or local governments, but they'd also have the condemnation cases. And then around year 12 or 13 of my career, I'm about 18 years in, I got lucky enough, somehow a national retail restaurant found me and just cold called and asked me to represent them on a highway taking in Waco.
Interesting.
No, this one was in Temple, I'm sorry. And then I was, with the economy in Texas, and I like that area of law. It fits with my litigation background.
Right.
It struck a nerve, and so I decided, man, I really like to develop this practice.
Gotcha. And so then when did you start at McFarland then?
I started at McFarland in October of 19.
Gotcha. And you're the first lawyer?
No, October of 20.
October of 20. Dude, it's COVID, right? Like it's pre-COVID, it's post-COVID. COVID screws with your head on when the dates are.
Yeah.
That's how it goes.
Yeah.
So you're the first lawyer for McFarland here in Dallas, is that right?
Yeah, Charles McFarland, who's,
an old, it's a small world. And when I started my career at Vincent & Elkins, I worked, 3 offices down from Charles McFarland. So it's a small world.
Yeah. Charles, we're based in Houston. He's an old Vincent & Elkins lawyer.
Right.
I used to work at Vincent & Elkins. He went out on his own, and one of the best in the state, if not the best. One of the type of lawyers, when you're in the room with him, you just are in awe of his acumen. And so he started the Dallas office at the beginning of 2020, and he actually started it. I wasn't there, but they had an associate first. Then they hired me. That associate's moved on.
Gotcha.
So it's now me.
Gotcha.
With the Dallas
To
office.
build
I was
the
the first
office.
partner. Yeah, I was hired to develop the Dallas market for McFarland. Yeah.
Congratulations. That's great.
It's very exciting.
All right, so we're going to talk, if it's not clear, we're going to talk about eminent domain, which is what Dan does. And just so our listeners understand, eminent domain, condemnation, taking, we've used these terms. They're all sort of related to the same thing. I know when I first started doing this, like I hear, condemnation and condemn, and I'd think, oh, is that something different? But no, it means eminent domain. So let's talk about kind of just the basics of eminent domain, how it works, and what governments use it for, and that kind of thing.
Sure. Yeah, so in October of 2020, like you mentioned, my firm, that's all we do is eminent domain condemnation work. We represent landowners across the state whenever they have their real property impacted by a governmental taking. And just to kind of elaborate on what you were saying earlier, eminent domain is the power the governments have to take your property. Condemnation is the process.
Right.
So it's the exercise of the right is eminent domain, and then condemnation is how they get there.
Gotcha.
And
how does that process work? So what are the basic steps?
So it starts with, I'm not going to get into what TxDOT does because that's a long process, but TxDOT, I just did a blog article about this actually, what TxDOT does prior to when the landowner's involved. So it's obviously, as you can imagine, Sean, a 5 to 10 year process where they're designing and developing roads.
Before they even talk to the landowner.
Correct.
Okay, gotcha.
They're talking to the landowners, and they're talking to the landowners not directly, but through public meetings and public notices.
Gotcha.
In instances like that, where they tell the folks, we're coming to your land or your neighborhood, would be a better way to put it. And folks can go to these public meetings and figure out, okay, where's my property on this map and how's it going to impact it?
Gotcha. Okay.
Right. Then when they finalize their plans, they go into the acquisition phase or the right-of-way phase. And that's when we get involved, or we can get involved earlier. But, the landowner receives an offer.
Right.
Is the first, okay, this is real.
Right. And they receive that, is it usually a letter? Is that how, I'm trying to remember, is that how it works?
Yeah. Texas is one of 24 states that requires an offer first.
Okay.
So half the country, the state can go straight to the courthouse. Texas is one of 24 states that require a written offer first.
Gotcha. And I'm just going to say, and maybe you'll say it, maybe you won't, but if you're one of these commercial property owners and you get an offer for your property from the state or from TxDOT or whatever, don't just accept it. Like, talk to a lawyer, because I mean, I've dealt with this a little bit, and they're not gonna give you a full fair market offer, right? Like, most of the time. Am I right on that?
Did you watch Arrested Development?
Yeah.
So fans of Arrested Development, there's always money in the banana stand.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. Exactly.
There's always going to be some way to increase the offer. Now the question is how much.
Right.
And we would tell you, we don't think we can increase it enough for you to hire a lawyer. If that's the case,
right.
Every property is unique, and every offer is unique. The state uses appraisers from across the state.
Right.
And they all have different opinions and different philosophies. Appraisal is an art, not a science. So the long and short of this is every offer is going to be different and every property is unique. So yes, you should call a lawyer immediately when you get an offer to help you go through that offer and figure out, is it acceptable or do I need to push back on certain things?
Right. Okay, so let's say I'm a landowner, I get an offer, I hire you, now what do we do?
If you have an offer,
Yep.
we are hired sometimes before an offer is made.
Okay.
That is not unusual.
Okay, gotcha.
So if you're a landowner and you know there's
It's
a project coming, you can call us and retain us. And if you get your offer and it's a good offer, we'll tell you that, and you go about your business.
Right.
But you can call whenever you like.
Gotcha.
It's the sooner you can get somebody involved, the better.
Right.
And we won't get into fee agreements, but most fee agreements should let the landowner, if they don't need a lawyer, they should be able to just proceed without the lawyer, without penalty.
Yeah.
Right. So we would be consulting with the landowner before the offer is received. Most of the time, because our fee is contingent, they don't have to pay us
Unless you're right,
until we get an increase in the offer. But in any event,
so we don't think the offer's sufficient. So now what do we do?
now we're going to take that offer and we're going to analyze it using all of our best methods.
Right.
Market data, talk to appraisers, look at the different components of the offer, and usually develop a spreadsheet, talk to the property owner, and at that point, develop a position for the case.
Gotcha.
Right? So you have your first offer in hand, and we're going to say to the landowner, we think we can get you this increase. And the landowner will say, okay, that sounds great. And we can either make an administrative settlement offer and try to.
This is before we go to any the commissioners or anything like that. Okay.
Right. So
Gotcha.
just to give the context, there's 3 phases.
Okay.
Offer phase, then you have this administrative phase, which is the special commissioner's hearing.
Right.
And then you have litigation.
Gotcha.
So we're in the offer phase. And if the landowner doesn't want to hire an appraiser, doesn't want to have the stomach for the fight, or they receive a pretty good offer but not a perfect offer, we may make an administrative settlement offer before, and the commissioners become involved before litigation.
Gotcha.
And the challenge with that is landowners want to make an offer, a counter offer,
Right.
and just be done.
Right.
But you have to have market data and a well thought out counter for TxDOT to approve it. As you can
Gotcha.
imagine, they're not going to just allow landowners to negotiate a 10% increase,
Right.
because they want to just be done.
Right.
You have to have market data and reason in a 3 or 4 page.
It's interesting. I was just doing a talk to people on property taxes yesterday, and it's very similar. I tell them you can't go in there with a narrative. You have to go in there with data, and because they're only going to respond to data, and it's the same thing, right? They if you want a reduction, in your case you want more, you have to show them exactly what the why you should get this exact amount, more, less, or more. And it sounds like, so it's a pretty similar process. It sounds like.
Yeah, that's a great analogy.
Yeah.
Great analogy. So if the property owner, if we can't come up with a counter, or the property owner is going to take a position that's such a big increase that it's not going to be acceptable, then we proceed to litigation.
Gotcha. Okay. And so the commissioner's hearing, you're in front of, is it 3 commissioners? Is that how it works?
Right. It's 3 property owners in the county.
Oh, 3 property owners in the county. Gotcha. Okay. And then you go to litigation.
Right.
Awesome.
So just to back up for a second, you're going to get an initial offer, then you're going to get a final offer.
Okay.
Okay. And they don't
Is
necessarily.
that before the commissioner's hearing? Okay. Gotcha.
Right. You get the initial offer, which has a 30-day deadline.
Yeah.
Then you get a final offer, which oftentimes is the same.
Right.
And that has a 14-day deadline.
Okay.
And then after those 14 days is when TxDOT will file their petition for condemnation.
Right.
But that doesn't trigger litigation because then the court will appoint the commissioners.
Gotcha.
So now you go from, even though they file a petition, you're not in litigation yet.
Gotcha. Okay, that makes sense. And at what stage of that, as a landowner, am I going to have to hire an outside appraiser or expert, basically, to help analyze this?
Usually, if you're past the offer phase, you've committed to hiring an expert.
Gotcha.
You can't. It's very difficult to go past the offer phase and succeed without an appraiser. Okay. So at that point, you're highly likely to have hired an appraiser. Sometimes we do go to commissioners' hearings with other data that we can get together. But often, if you're going past the offer, the landowner is probably best to be prepared that I'm going to need an appraiser. Because if you do too well at the commissioner's hearing,
right,
the state's going to object.
Gotcha.
So the commissioner's hearing is confusing that way because it's really, if either party objects to the commissioner's finding.
That's interesting. So does that happen a fair amount? Well, the state will take it to litigation from the commissioner's hearing?
Yes.
Interesting. Okay.
So that can be good and bad because you do well at the commissioner's hearing, and sometimes that can mess with expectations.
Yeah.
And also that money will become available to the property owner. So just using round numbers, if the state offers $1 million,
right,
and you're able to convince the commissioners to give you $10 million, then that $10 million is deposited in the registry of the court, and the landowner can come take it.
Oh, okay. So even if the state or whatever appeals, they have to deposit that money,
right,
and it's available, and then they can try to get that money back.
Right. Texas is a quick take state.
Interesting.
So to move the project along, they let the government deposit the money. You take possession of the money, and as soon as that money is deposited, the state now has possession of your land. So
gotcha.
they can go along with their project, and then the litigation doesn't hold that up.
Gotcha.
So you're giving up your property before you're fully adjudicated.
Right. Interesting. So what are your typical cases? Who are your clients? Are these, obviously they're commercial landowners, but are they along projects? Is that like government projects somehow usually? Or what's the premise for that basically? What's your typical client?
Yeah, it's not rocket science. They are in high growth areas where the infrastructure is expanding, right?
Yeah.
And what's interesting is TxDOT is a majority of our work, road construction, road expansion. But you really get a variety of entities that are condemning property. Water authorities, pipeline companies, the city of Dallas.
So who do all of these government entities have the authority of eminent domain, the power of eminent domain?
Yes.
Gotcha.
As long as it's for, usually public purpose is the general.
Right.
It used to be public use.
Gotcha.
I'm sorry, no, I had that backwards. It used to be public purpose. Now it's public use.
Which is more restrictive, I assume, than public purpose?
No, it's more expansive.
It's more expansive. Interesting. Okay. Well, let's get into that. So, this is obviously Greater Texas. We try to talk about some things that will really benefit Texas. And Texas is seeing massive growth. I think I've mentioned this before too, but we're up here in Dallas. Dallas is projected to pass Chicago population-wise in the next 15 years or something like that. And as a result, there's going to be a lot of projects. So what kind of, are there specific projects you're seeing? I think as a Central Texas, I know I-35 expansion is going to be a big one for us. What other projects do you see coming down the pike?
I think the interesting projects, the highway projects are interesting and they make news, but what I'm finding is that the projects for these, farm to market roads or state highways that usually connect the major thoroughfares are more problematic because the properties are worth more. There's less space to move, and the property owners are more, engaged,
entrenched.
dug in. So like for instance, there's a highway in the northern part of Dallas is growing tremendously.
Right.
Collin County, Denton County, Frisco. So our 3 arteries north-south are 35, and then toll road, and then 75, which turns into 45, right? And there's a University Boulevard or 380 runs east-west across 3 major high-growth counties right now. And TxDOT has to expand that. And that project.
So one of the things, like, let me take one step back because we'll come to that. But first of all, how does the government get this right? Because I know when I first found out about it, when I think lay people find out about it, meaning non-lawyers, it's kind of a shock that they have this power. But how did this come about? Like, where did they get this power from?
It's sort of the inverse of sovereign immunity. Sovereign immunity is fairly well known,
right?
And that's the idea that you can't sue the government,
right?
For most things, there are exceptions, which I can't speak to today.
Yeah, right.
So it's sort of the inverse of that the government has to have the right to take property to continue to function and develop its citizens, because the alternative is not plausible, which would be the government has to go to each landowner and try to buy the property. And as you can imagine, as soon as the landowner realizes that, they're going to either hold out or ask for an astronomical price, which would fairly quickly bankrupt the government.
Gotcha. So in general, like it's not reasonable for them to just go to the market and buy this property, is what you're saying, basically.
Right. It's a protection for both the government and the landowner that they have to pay fair market value.
Okay.
The landowner shouldn't get a windfall for this,
right?
And neither should the government get a discount. So what's interesting is this right is in both the Bill of Rights for the United States Constitution and the Bill of Rights of the Texas Constitution.
Gotcha.
It's an interesting right because it has both sides of it has the government's rights and the citizens' rights.
I see what you're
if you
saying.
see free
Right,
speech, it doesn't have it, and it
Right.
doesn't have any qualifiers, or it's just free speech. This
Right.
one has, okay, here's what the government can do, and here's what the private citizen's entitled to, or the property owner, which is interesting to.
And I assume local municipalities have this power also, right?
Right. Yeah, the Texas Constitution allows.
Gotcha.
that.
Is it one thing you mentioned earlier was you talked about how it has to be used for public use now. I think I know back a long time ago when I was at D&E and we did a little bit of this, there was some research into, all right, the government is taking land and then giving it to some private entities and they're building private use places. Are those still issues that you face, or has that kind of been sorted out, or how does that?
Right. So just to give you some context, the Texas comptroller you have to register if you want to be able to use the right of eminent domain. And there are 6,000 entities registered with the right to use eminent domain. It ranges from pipeline companies to water authorities to schools, school districts, towns. So it's very expansive. You don't think of those things, right? You think of TxDOT immediately.
Right.
Not you, but generally speaking.
Yeah.
So, I'm sorry, what did you ask?
6,000.
So 6,000 entities.
Private use.
Private use. So back in 2005, the United States Supreme Court came out with its landmark decision in Kelo. Kelo is a case that stands for the proposition that a state government can condemn private property and force it to another private party for economic development purposes.
There's no way that's going to go over well in Texas, right? I know Texas landowners, right? Like, there's no way that's going to go over well.
And it didn't.
Yeah.
And so quickly, the Constitution and the statutes were amended to protect against that.
Gotcha. So now it can only be used for public use. Is that a pretty broad definition of what public use is?
A little bit. It can be used for to help with urban blight or any sort of blight. Pipeline and utility companies can use it, right? We know that in Texas.
Yeah, right.
As long as they're a common carrier.
Gotcha.
That's another topic for another podcast, but
Right.
it's not unfettered, but it's very difficult to challenge. It's called a right to take challenge.
So I was going to ask you that too. As a property owner, obviously I can protest the value that they are of my taking. Can I also protest their right to take?
You can, but we would
But it's
not
not gonna
recommend
work.
it. That is the quintessential definition of fighting City Hall.
Okay.
And you are highly, highly unlikely to be successful, and you're going to spend a lot of money trying to get that done. If they don't give you an appropriate offer, if they don't follow the statutory steps in the condemnation process, there are relief valves for the property owner, but ultimately they're going to get the property.
Gotcha. Okay. And you think, we talked about this a little bit before, you think in general the process is pretty good. It works pretty well. Is that right?
Yeah. Looking at the way Texas property owners are protected on the front end, they have to get 2 written offers. The written offers have to be based on an appraisal, which I think that's not standard across the country.
Oh, really?
Right.
Okay.
Texas has, over the last 10 to 15 years, they've been evolving the statutory construct of the condemnation process, and most of those times it's for the property owner in favor of trying to tweak the system. And, the attorney generals that I deal with are always very cooperative. The end of the day is get the property owner paid and let us get the property. There's really no, like I was saying earlier, efforts to get windfalls on either side. Typically the process works out the way it should.
As long as the property owner is represented, right? Like that's the key structure. So are there improvements that you can see to it, or is it abused ever by the entities?
I think I don't see any malicious abuse, obviously, but the way I could see it being improved for property owners, obviously having their attorney's fees paid would be ideal.
Yeah, exactly.
Some states do provide for that.
It's a good point, though. I mean, when you're taking 30, 40%, whatever it is, off of what the property owner is going to get, the fair market value, just so they can get their fair market value, I think there's some sense in there of paying attorney's fees. Obviously, I'm biased. I'm not an attorney, but I think there's a good argument there that they should be paid, right?
Yes. Yeah, I agree. Because it does impact their ability to make a business decision, because they know at the end of the day they're going to have to pay a lawyer, and the state really doesn't.
Right. It's a good point.
So
okay.
They have their assistant attorney generals, but it's not coming.
So here you go, state legislature. There's a change for you. Let's make sure the attorneys get paid.
The other, I wouldn't call it abuse, but the other frustration I see is when the process takes a long time. So I told you earlier that when you get your first offer, you have a 30-day deadline to respond. And when you get your final offer, you have 14 days. But, from the time you learn of a project to when you get your offer and go through the commissioner process and litigation, there's really no safeguards on the landowner for that taking a long time. They don't have to send their final offer by a certain date. They have to wait a certain amount of time.
I see. Okay. Right?
Yeah. So you can get your final offer, your initial offer, 30-day deadline, but you may not get your next offer for 2 months. Or it's really not in the landowner's control, and that can be difficult.
Because I'm trying to think from a real estate perspective, there's nothing the property owner can do with his property when he's got this sort of Damocles hanging over him, where he knows that he's going to lose at least part of that property, right, to condemnation. So he's just kind of stuck there with his property while he waits for the condemning authority to do something about it.
Right. And they can walk away.
If plans change, I guess. Right.
It happens more with local governments, but they could theoretically walk away before they could walk away at any time. Once they file their petition, they have to reimburse you for any costs you've incurred.
Gotcha.
If they make an offer and plans change, or like budgets change, or new government comes into place, they can walk away and they don't owe you anything. So an improvement would be then to put some kind of time limit on
on this process, right?
Right.
From a landowner's perspective.
Yeah, and usually once the offer process gets started, it moves pretty quickly. But even before that, as we were mentioning earlier, you can get notices of public meetings.
Right.
Before they make their offer, you're going to get a call from an appraiser, their appraiser wanting to get on your property.
In Austin, I had a client who was looking at buying a property, and he backed out of the deal because it was along the I-35 corridor. And what that shows you is, for that seller of that property, this is a real problem for him, right? Because he's now, who knows when I-35 is going to start? Who knows when it's going to start, right? Yet this landowner is having potential buyers walk away from a sale because of this potential condemnation that will happen, or eminent domain power that will happen who knows when, right? So that's a perfect example.
Right, and further complicating it, let's take the I-35 Capital Express project. It's broken into 3 segments, and each segment is not on the same timeline. They're often years apart. So even though your neighbor north or south is having their property taken, or they've got an offer letter, you've not received anything, and you're waiting, but little do you know that part, you're in a segment that's 2 years behind.
Right.
The process. So it really, creates issues for property owners holding property before the process formally starts. Even when the process formally starts, it can take too long, but we're talking even before the process starts, when the appraiser contacts you, or you get wind of it, or you're...
Yeah, and as soon as that happens, it's going to be covered in the media, right? It's going to be covered in the news, and so it's out there. That information's out there. So
yeah, I was talking to an opposing counsel for condemning authority the other day, and he says to me, "Oh, by the way, I don't think your landowner knew that this project was coming, that the seller didn't disclose it to him. This is your world. I don't, disclosure on commercial properties, but it is an issue for these folks like you're talking about, because they learn of these things, and it can be very impactful, obviously.
Gotcha.
To lose your front parking, or to lose driveways, and you may not be getting the same tract you thought you were getting."
That's interesting. Well, Dan, thanks for coming here. So one of the things we always end with is we're trying to build a better Texas here. Outside of making sure attorneys' fees get paid, which obviously helps the attorneys, but I'm serious, it also helps the landowners, and putting a time sort of crunch on, or time frame on this. Anything else that you see that could be changed to make Texas better?
Karma.
Texas.
Everyone just do their little part. I believe in karma. And if you see a piece of trash on the ground, pick it up. Let's all just do the little things to make Texas's karma better every day.
Makes sense. Well, Dan, thanks for being here. If property owners out there, if you get a letter from or even before you get a letter from a condemning authority, call Dan Tobin at McFarland. He will help you out and make sure you get fair market value for your property. So thanks a lot, Dan. Appreciate it.
This was fun.
Yep. Thanks.